Lady Vivian Fairfax stood in the east parterre garden at midnight, her father's letters still folded in her pocket, and stared at 5 white peonies that had not existed 4 days ago. The moonlight caught the petals. Duchesse de Nemours, her mother's cultivar, the flowers her father had uprooted 9 years ago when he replaced Margaret's garden with a stone terrace. Someone had planted them in the exact spacing her mother used, crowns facing east to catch the morning light, root depth precise enough that Vivian knew immediately this was not the work of a groundskeeper following orders. Her hands trembled as she knelt in the damp earth, because naming what she loved had always given someone a weapon, and she had named these flowers to a man whose family was supposed to be her enemy. Behind her, a shadow moved in the yew-walk. Sebastian Hale, Duke of Lockwood, stepped into the moonlight with soil still dark beneath his fingernails. September arrived at Blackmir Park with the kind of golden light that made promises the coming months would not keep. The gravel drive curved through an avenue of copper beeches, their leaves just beginning to turn, and the house itself rose from the parkland like something that had grown there rather than been built. All warm stone and mullioned windows that caught the afternoon sun. 2 carriages rounded the final curve simultaneously, one from the east and one from the west, and converged in the entrance with the precise timing of rivals who had been watching each other's approach for the last mile. The Lockwood carriage, black lacquer with the ducal crest in silver, reached the steps first by perhaps 3 seconds. Sebastian Hale descended with the economy of movement that characterized everything he did, his dark coat perfectly fitted, his expression revealing nothing. He was 31, though he carried himself with the restraint of someone much older, and he had not smiled in public since his mother's funeral 9 years ago. The servants knew. The household staff whispered it. The Duke who never smiles. The second carriage, the Fairfax coach in deep blue, pulled alongside just as Sebastian's boot touched the gravel. The door opened, and Lady Vivian Fairfax stepped down before the footman could fully extend the step. She wore a traveling coat the color of cornflowers, and her dark hair had come partially loose from its pins during the journey, curling against her neck in a way that suggested she had more important things to attend to than perfect grooming. Under her arm she carried a leather portfolio, worn at the edges, on that she held like a shield. Their eyes met across the 10 feet of gravel that separated the 2 carriages. Sebastian spoke first. "Miss Fairfax." His voice carried the particular flatness of someone determined to be correct. She nodded. "Your Grace, we appear to have arrived simultaneously. The Fairfax faction is punctual. I'm told the Lockwood faction prefers to arrive first and arrange the furniture to advantage." Something flickered in Vivian's eyes. Not quite amusement, but close. "I am told the Lockwood faction prefers to stand on higher ground during conversations. You're currently 3 steps above me. Is this deliberate?" Sebastian looked down. He was indeed standing on the 3rd step, having mounted them while she remained at carriage level. For a moment, something almost human crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps, that she had noticed. Then he descended. 1 step, 2, 3. He stopped on the gravel, level with her. He met her gaze. "Better?" "Adequate. Though I notice you chose to descend rather than invite me up. I was not certain you would accept the invitation." "You are correct. I would not have." They stood there, 2 people from families that had opposed each other in Parliament for 3 generations, and the air between them carried the particular charge that comes when intelligence recognizes intelligence and does not quite know what to do about it. A small voice broke the moment. "You have leaves in your hair?" Sebastian turned. His niece Maisie stood on the carriage step, 5 years old and utterly unimpressed by the political theater unfolding before her. She wore a gray traveling dress and clutched a cloth doll to her chest. And then she was staring at Vivian with a frank assessment of someone too young to have learned discretion. Vivian's hand went to her temple and found an oak leaf caught in the loosened curls. She pulled it free and examined it as though it were evidence in a trial. "So I do. Thank you for the observation. What is your doll's name?" "Primrose. She is named after a flower because Uncle Sebastian says flowers are the most honest things in any garden. They do not pretend to be something they are not." Sebastian's face did something complicated. For just a moment the mask slipped, and Vivian saw beneath it grief, perhaps, or memory, or both. Then it was gone, sealed away behind the careful blankness he wore like armor. Vivian continued watching him. "Your uncle is a philosopher. He is a duke. But Primrose says dukes can also be philosophers if they try hard enough." Sebastian's voice was quiet. Maisie, inside. Mrs. Hewitt is waiting. The child went, but not before giving Vivian one last, measuring look that suggested she had reached some private conclusion about the woman with leaves in her hair. When she was gone, Vivian turned back to Sebastian. Your niece is charming. She is honest. As you have just learned, she considers it a virtue inherited from flowers. And do you consider honesty a virtue? I consider it a complication, which is not the same thing as a virtue, though it may occasionally overlap. We are going to spend 3 weeks in the same house, negotiating a canal amendment that will determine whether my mother's wetland survey becomes a footnote or a legal barrier. Your faction wants the northern route. My faction wants the southern. One of us will leave here having failed. He held her gaze. Yes. And you believe honesty is a complication. I believe we are both here because our families sent us. I believe we will do what we came to do. And I believe that pretending we are not opponents would be the least honest thing either of us could attempt. Vivian studied him for a moment longer. Then she picked up her skirts and walked past him toward the entrance, the portfolio still tucked under her arm. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. Your niece was correct about one thing. What is that? I did have leaves in my hair, and you noticed before she did. You simply chose not to mention it. She disappeared inside before he could respond, leaving Sebastian standing alone on the gravel drive, with the September sun slanting through the beaches and the uncomfortable realization that Vivian Fairfax had just won the first exchange of what promised to be a very long 3 weeks. The negotiations began the following morning in Blackmir's library, a long room with windows overlooking the park and walls lined with books that no one in the current generation had read. A large table dominated the center, already covered with maps of the River Thane corridor, survey documents, and the proposed canal routes marked in red and blue ink. Lord Sefton, who owned Blackmir and had volunteered it as neutral ground, presided from the head of the table with the weary air of a man who had agreed to host a month-long argument and was already regretting it. And the Lockwood faction occupied the right side. Sebastian, his uncle Lord Philip Hale, and 2 other men whose primary function appeared to be nodding at appropriate moments. The Fairfax faction held the left. Vivian, her father Lord Ormond, a man with iron-gray hair and the expression of someone calculating profit margins during a funeral, and a secretary who took notes in silence. The first 3 days established the pattern. Lord Philip would propose something. Ormond would counter. The maps would be examined. Voices would rise slightly, then fall back into the careful language of men who had been doing this for decades. Sebastian said little, watching from his position at Philip's right hand, his face revealing nothing. Vivian spoke more than her father preferred, which became obvious by the 4th day when Ormond cut her off mid-sentence with a hand gesture that suggested he had been doing so for years. She stopped speaking, but her jaw tightened in a way that Sebastian noticed from across the table. He noticed many things about Vivian Fairfax during those first days. The way she held her pen when she was thinking. The way her eyes went to the windows when Philip was speaking, as though she were calculating something the rest of them could not see. The way she defended her mother's wetland survey, not with sentiment but with numbers. Rental income projections, agricultural output, flood damage calculations from the past 30 years. On the 5th day, Philip made a mistake. Miss Fairfax, we are debating a canal route, not a botanical survey. Your mother's work is charming, I'm sure. But the economic considerations... Vivian's voice could have cut glass. The economic considerations are precisely what I am discussing. The northern route crosses 47 documented species habitats that provide natural flood barriers during the spring runoff. If you destroy those barriers, the farms along the lower Thane will flood. When the farms flood, your lordship's tenants cannot pay their rents. When your tenants cannot pay, your income declines by approximately 12%, based on the 1793 flood records. I am not discussing flowers. I am discussing your money. The room went very quiet. Philip's face did something complicated. Ormond's eyes narrowed, though whether with approval or irritation was impossible to tell. Sebastian's pen stopped moving. He had been taking notes. He always took notes. But now he simply sat there with his hand frozen above the paper, staring at Vivian Fairfax as she systematically dismantled his uncle's condescension using agricultural economics and historical flood data. Vivian pulled a slim document from her portfolio. The survey contains detailed documentation of the water iris beds in the lower marsh. Those beds absorb approximately 40% of the overflow during heavy rainfall. Remove them, and you will need to build retention walls at a cost that exceeds the projected savings from the northern route by a factor of 3. My mother spent 10 years cataloging this corridor because she understood that beauty and function are not opposites. They are the same thing, measured by different people. She set the document on the table. The room remained silent. Sebastian looked down at his notes and realized he had written a single sentence. She is translating science into the only language that will preserve it. That evening, he found himself walking the gardens at dusk, a habit he had developed in the years since his mother's death, when movement became easier than stillness. The Blackmir grounds were well maintained, but not exceptional. The kind of garden that spoke of competent staff rather than passion. He walked the gravel paths with his hands behind his back, careful not to touch anything, and tried not to think about the woman who had spent the afternoon defending her mother's work with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much it cost to care about things that other people dismissed. He was near the east parterre when he heard voices, a child's laughter and then a woman's voice, patient and clear. He rounded the hedge and stopped. Vivian knelt in the border bed with Maisie beside her, examining something in the soil. Both of them had dirt on their hands. Maisie's doll sat propped against a nearby stone, keeping watch. Maisie pointed. What is this one? Aster. See the star shape? That is how you remember the name. Aster means star. What would you plant here, if this was your garden? Vivian sat back on her heels, considering. White peonies, against the yellow stone. My mother grew a cultivar called Duchesse de Nemours. She planted them along the south wall of our garden because they needed morning light to open properly. The petals would catch the sun and glow like paper lanterns. Where are they now? Vivian's hands stilled in the soil. My father had the garden pulled up when I was 16. He wanted a terrace for entertaining. The peonies were removed to make room for flagstones. Maisie's voice rang with conviction. That is horrible. Flowers are not furniture. You cannot just remove them. Sebastian spoke from the path. Maisie. He had not meant to speak. He had meant to walk away before they noticed him. But the word had escaped before he could prevent it. And now they were both looking at him, Maisie with surprise, Vivian with something more complicated. Uncle Sebastian. Miss Fairfax's father removed her mother's peonies to make a terrace. Tell her that is horrible. Sebastian stood 3 feet away, with his hands still clasped behind his back. And for a moment he could not speak at all. Duchesse de Nemours, his mother's cultivar. The same peonies he had planted by candlelight the night she died, his hands in cold November soil, while the household prepared her body inside. The same peonies that still bloomed every June along the chapel wall at Lockwood, tended by groundskeepers because Sebastian had not been able to touch a garden tool since that night without his chest seizing. His voice sounded wrong. It is unfortunate. Vivian was watching him with the same attention she had given the maps in the library, reading something in his face that he had not meant to show. Your mother gardened. It was not a question. He answered simply. Yes. And you? His reply was flat. No. That is not what I asked. I asked if you garden, not whether you employ people to do it for you. The silence stretched between them. I am broken only by Maisie, humming softly as she examined another flower. I do not garden. It was the truth, and also a lie, and he could see in Vivian's eyes that she knew the difference. He turned and walked back toward the house, with his hands still locked behind his back, because if he let them loose, they might remember things he had spent 9 years teaching them to forget. That night, at 2 in the morning, Sebastian's body made a decision his mind had been refusing for 9 years. He stood in his shirt sleeves in the Blackmir east parterre, with a candle lantern at his feet, and 5 Duchesse de Nemours specimens arranged on the grass beside him. The root balls were wrapped in burlap, still damp from the nursery soil. He had sent Dawson, his secretary, on a 7-hour round trip to Bath that afternoon with instructions that probably sounded insane. Find mature Duchesse de Nemours peonies out of season and bring them back before midnight. Dawson had returned at 11:30 with 5 specimens in cold storage and a receipt that would raise questions Sebastian did not intend to answer. Now he knelt in the earth with his bare hands in the soil for the first time since the night his mother died. The sensation was overwhelming, cold soil against his palms, the smell of turned earth, the weight of the root ball as he positioned it in the hole he had dug with a trowel borrowed from the garden shed. His hands remembered everything, the exact depth, the crown positioning, the way his mother had taught him to spread the roots so they would take hold properly. 2 inches below the soil line, crowns facing east, morning light. He planted all 5 in the space of an hour, working with the methodical precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times and then stopped abruptly and completely. His hands shook. Twice he had to stop and steady himself, palms pressed flat against the earth, breathing through the cascade of memory that threatened to undo him. His mother's hands over his, teaching him crown depth when he was 12, the smell of the Lockwood gardens in June. Her voice, "Peonies are patient, Sebastian. You plant them in autumn, and they wait all winter under the snow. That is faith, putting something in the ground and trusting it will return." The night she died, he had planted the Duchesse de Nemours by the chapel wall because it was the last thing she had asked for. "I want to bloom in June," she'd said, her voice already fading. "Plant them for me. Promise." He had promised. And then he had knelt in November darkness with his hands in frozen soil and understood that planting and losing had fused into the same gesture. That putting things in the ground meant burial. The gardens were where the dead lived, and he could not enter without drowning. 9 years. 9 years of walking through his mother's design every morning, directing the groundskeepers, maintaining her vision from a distance, never touching the soil because touching it meant that night, that loss, that unbearable weight of things that grow and bloom and die. Until Vivian Fairfax said Duchesse de Nemours in a garden at dusk, and something below his conscious control recognized the sound. He sat back on his heels and looked at the 5 peonies, Salp barely visible in the candlelight. The planting was perfect. His mother would have approved. And for the first time in 9 years, that thought did not break him. It steadied him. He was crying. He realized it distantly, the way you realize it is raining when you have been walking in it for several minutes. Tears on his face, his hands still in the soil, and the overwhelming relief of discovering that his body could do this again. That planting for someone living was not a betrayal of the dead. That soil could mean beginning, not only burial. He stayed there until the candle burned low, his hands in the earth, and let himself remember everything he had been running from. The next morning, he had Vivian entered the library to find Sebastian already at the table, examining the flood projections she had left there the night before. Only he had added notes in the margins, references to the 1793 records, cross-calculations she had not considered. His handwriting was precise, almost architectural. She set down her portfolio. "You found errors? I found gaps. Your flood damage estimates are conservative. The Lockwood estate records show higher water levels than your survey indicates. You are helping me argue against your own faction's position. I am correcting incomplete data. There is a difference." Vivian sat down across from him and pulled the projections closer. His notes were meticulous, each one sourced and dated. "Why?" "Because your mother's survey deserves accurate support. If it is going to stand as evidence, it should be unassailable." He finally looked up, and Vivian saw something in his face she had not seen before. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the aftermath of something that had cost him. There was dirt under his fingernails. She noticed it because she had spent enough time in gardens to recognize soil that had been there recently, not days ago. Her observation was direct. "You have been gardening." Sebastian's hand stilled on the papers. "No. Your fingernails suggest otherwise. I was adjusting a border bed. It is not the same thing." "What is the difference?" "Gardening implies pleasure. What I did was correction." Vivian studied him for a moment longer, and then let it go. But she filed the information away, alongside everything else she had observed about Sebastian Hale. The way he stiffened when Philip mentioned his mother, the careful distance he maintained from the garden beds during their evening walks. The fact that Maisie's comment about flowers being honest had come from somewhere, someone. A voice Sebastian was still hearing. The days that followed built a language between them that neither of them named. Sebastian began sitting beside Vivian during the negotiations rather than across from her, a subtle repositioning that Philip noticed but did not comment on. When Lord Ormond dismissed one of Vivian's points, Sebastian would lean forward and add a supporting reference from the Lockwood archives, his voice neutral, but his geometry declaring allegiance. They walked the gardens at dusk with Maisie between them, and Sebastian showed the child how to identify leaf shapes, while Vivian watched him not quite touch the plants he was describing. Their hands began to overlap during the work sessions. A map corner needed holding while Vivian traced the river course. Sebastian's hand appeared to steady it, his fingers covering hers for 4 seconds longer than necessary. She passed him a document, and their palms brushed, and neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact built in increments, a touch on the shoulder to get his attention, his hand at her elbow when she stumbled on the gravel path. The way they had begun to stand close enough during conversations that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling September evenings. On the 10th day, Vivian found a botanical reference book on her library desk, a 19th century manual on wetland species, open to the section on water iris. A note in Sebastian's handwriting. Page 47 supports your flood barrier argument. The root structure data may be useful. She turned to page 47 and found a detailed illustration of iris roots, their depth and spread marked in careful measurements. She stood there holding the book and understood that Sebastian Hale had spent his evening reading botanical texts to strengthen her argument, and that this, not the polite conversations, not the careful distance, was the truth of what was happening between them. That night she left a response on his desk. A sketch of the Thane corridor with her mother's survey annotations, marked with the locations where the canal would do irreversible damage. No note, just the map, which said everything that needed saying. The 11th day arrived with clear skies and a letter from Vivian's father that she read standing by the library window and then folded very carefully before placing it in her pocket. Sebastian, when entering to return a volume to the shelves, saw her face and stopped. He asked quietly, "Bad news?" A reminder that failure has consequences. She did not elaborate, and Sebastian did not press. But that evening, when they walked the gardens with Maisie, Vivian was quieter than usual, her attention distant. At the east parterre, she stopped and stared at the border bed, as though seeing it for the first time. She spoke slowly. "Something has changed here." Sebastian's heart did something complicated in his chest. "The gardeners have been working on the beds." She walked closer. "No, this bed was bare 4 days ago." I walked past it. There were gaps in the planting. She knelt, examining the soil. "These are new, recently planted. The soil is still settling." She reached out and touched one of the white blooms, her fingers gentle on the petals. Then she went very still. Her voice was barely audible. "These are Duchesse de Nemours." Sebastian could not breathe, could not move, could not do anything except stand there while Vivian Fairfax knelt in the dirt beside the peonies he had planted at 2 in the morning with hands that had not touched soil in 9 years, and watched her understand. She asked without looking up, "Who planted these?" His answer was simple. "I did." Vivian turned to look at him, her hand still on the flower. "When?" "The night you told me your favorite flower." What followed was not empty silence. It was full of everything neither of them had said, every careful distance they had maintained, every touch that had lasted 4 seconds instead of 3. Maisie, sensing something beyond her understanding, then wandered toward a nearby bench with her doll and began a conversation that involved both of them and several imaginary guests. Vivian's voice was very quiet. "You sourced mature specimens, out of season. The nursery and bath had 5 in cold storage. You positioned the crowns facing east. Morning light, your mother's method." Vivian stood slowly, brushing soil from her skirt. "You knew the crown orientation because your mother planted the same cultivar." He confirmed it. "Yes. At Lockwood. By the chapel wall. She died when I was 22. Her last request was that I plant Duchesse de Nemours where she could bloom in June. I planted them the night she died, November, by candle lantern, my hands in cold soil while the household prepared her body inside." Vivian's eyes widened slightly, an understanding moving across her face like light. Sebastian continued, because he had started and could not stop now, could not seal this back up once it had broken open. "I have not gardened since. 9 years. The Lockwood grounds are maintained by professionals who follow her plans. I walk through her garden every morning, and I cannot bring myself to touch what she built, because touching it means that night, that loss, the feeling of putting something in the ground and knowing she was going into the ground, and I could not." He stopped, breathed. Vivian was watching him with an expression he could not read. She spoke softly. "Until 4 days ago. Until you said the name of her flower and my body decided the paralysis was over. I was in this garden at 2 in the morning with my hands in the soil before I understood what I was doing. And then it was not the same as that night. It was the opposite. Not burial. Not ending. I was planting for someone living, and it broke something open that has been sealed for 9 years. Her confession was direct. I am frightened. Of me? Of what you now know. Every time I have named something precious, someone has converted it into leverage. My mother's garden became a terrace. Her survey became my father's bargaining tool. I mentioned the peonies because my guard dropped for 9 seconds. And now you have this, the knowledge of where I am soft. Sebastian crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I converted it into a flower bed. Not a weapon, a garden. She acknowledged it. I noticed. The distinction is the only one that has ever mattered. Oh, and I have never encountered it before either. He extended his hand, palm up. There was still soil under his fingernails from 4 nights ago, dark crescents that no amount of washing had completely removed. Vivian looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she took it, her fingers curling around his palm, and pressed it flat against the nearest peony, cold petals and living stem against his skin and hers. That is what your mother gave you. Not grief, not paralysis. This. The ability to put something living in the ground and trust it will survive. That is not consolation, whatever your uncle might tell you. That is the most honest thing a person can do. Sebastian's hand, covered by hers, steadied against the flower. And for the first time in 9 years, he let himself believe that planting did not have to mean losing, that sometimes it meant the opposite. Day 15 arrived with Lord Ormond. He came unannounced, which Vivian should have expected because her father considered announcements a courtesy for people who had not disappointed him. She was in the greenhouse when he found her, working on amendments to the flood projections with her mother's survey open beside her. The door opened without warning, and Ormond stood there in his traveling coat, his expression carved from stone. His command was brief. Walk with me. It was not a request. They went to the far end of the garden, well away from the house, where the ornamental paths gave way to kitchen beds and the air smelled of turned compost. Ormond stopped beside a row of espalier pears and turned to face his daughter. The amendment is failing. You have spent 2 weeks arguing ecology to men who understand only money. Lord Sefton is wavering. The Lockwood faction is holding firm, and you have formed an attachment that compromises your effectiveness. Vivian's hands went cold. I have formed no such thing. Do not insult my intelligence. The Duke of Lockwood sits beside you during negotiations. He walks the gardens with you in the evenings. He's been seen annotating your projections. Philip Hale wrote to me 3 days ago suggesting that your presence here has become a distraction to his nephew. Lord Philip is concerned that his nephew has developed an inconvenient conscience. That is not the same thing as attachment. It is close enough to be dangerous. You were sent here to secure the canal amendment, not to make friends with the opposition. If you cannot do what you were sent to do, there are consequences. What consequences? Ormond reached into his coat and withdrew a letter, folded and sealed. If the Fairfax amendment fails, if the northern route is approved, I will sell your mother's wetland survey to the canal company. They have already made an offer. A generous one. Your mother's illustrations will be used as evidence that the corridor is navigable and ecologically stable. Her life's work will become the legal justification for its own destruction. Vivian stared at her father and felt the ground shift beneath her. You would not. I would. I pulled her garden for a terrace because maintaining it was impractical. I will sell her survey because losing it is expensive. Your sentiment does not change economics, Vivian. It only makes you ineffective. She was your wife. She was a woman who painted flowers. Beautiful work, utterly useless unless someone finds a way to make it profitable. You have 8 days to secure the amendment. If you fail, I sell the survey. Do you understand? Vivian understood. She understood that her father had just converted her mother's legacy into a threat, that every outcome except perfect success would weaponize Margaret's science, that she was standing in a garden arguing with a man who had uprooted his dead wife's peonies and felt nothing. Her voice was steady. I understand. Good. Then stop walking gardens with the Duke of Lockwood and start doing your job. He left her standing among the pear trees, the letter still in his hand, and Vivian waited until he was gone before she allowed herself to shake. That night, she did not go to the gardens. She went to the library and worked until 3 in the morning on revised flood projections, building the economic argument that would move the room because sentiment would not. Because her father was right that men like Philip Hale did not care about water iris beds or her mother's 10 years of careful observation. She fell asleep at the desk with her face on the papers, ink smudging her cheek, and did not hear the door open at 4:30 when Sebastian found her there. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep in the chair with botanical illustrations scattered around her like fallen leaves. Then he crossed the room in silence, removed his coat, and draped it over her shoulders without waking her. He sat down at the opposite end of the table and began reading her projections. And when he found the flood damage estimates, he pulled the Lockwood estate records from his own files and started annotating her numbers with the data she needed. His handwriting appeared in the margins beside hers. His knowledge applied to her argument. His silence protecting her sleep while he worked on her behalf, because this was the only language he had that his position permitted. When Vivian woke at dawn, she found Sebastian's coat over her shoulders and her flood projections covered in his notes. Parliamentary references, cross-calculations, the 1793 records she had not been able to access. He was gone, but the work remained. And she sat there holding the papers and understood that Sebastian Hale had spent the night building her argument stronger because he could not say what he wanted to say. So he said it with sources and data and the meticulous care of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. She folded his coat and placed it on the chair. Then she gathered the annotated projections and went to prepare for a fight her father had just made infinitely more complicated. 3 days of silence followed. Vivian withdrew from the evening garden walks, claiming work. Sebastian did not press. They sat on opposite sides of the negotiation table again, the careful distance restored. And if Philip noticed the change, he said nothing. But the east parterre sat outside the library window where Vivian worked, and the morning room where Sebastian read, and both of them spent more time than was reasonable looking at the same 5 white peonies from different windows. Maisie noticed, because Maisie noticed everything. She announced at breakfast on day 17. Uncle Sebastian is looking at the peonies through his window. Miss Fairfax is looking at the peonies through her window. Why do you not both just go to the peonies? Sebastian replied carefully. It is complicated, Maisie. Primrose says things are only complicated when people will not say what they mean. She went back to her toast with a satisfied air of someone who had solved a problem the adults were too foolish to address. That afternoon, Vivian found something on her library desk. A sketch on the back of a parliamentary brief, Duchesse de Nemours, rendered in pen and ink with the precision of someone who had drawn botanical specimens before, and then stopped. The stamen count was exact. The root structure notation appeared in the margin in handwriting she now recognized. No signature, no note, just the drawing, which said everything that needed saying. She held it to the window and examined the line work. Sebastian's mother's technique, she suspected. Learned young and then abandoned when gardening became impossible. Drawn from memory after 9 years because Vivian had named a flower and he had planted it, and now he was drawing it, because his hands had remembered what his grief had sealed away. She placed the sketch inside her mother's survey on page 47, where the water iris illustrations were, and understood that they were building something neither of them could name safely, a collection of evidence that care could exist without leverage, that naming could produce protection instead of weapons. The 2 people from rival families could stand in the same garden and mean the same thing. But her father's letter remained in her pocket, and 8 days had become 5, and the amendment was still failing. Day 19 arrived cold and clear. The negotiations had reached the point where every argument had been made twice, and the room was simply waiting for someone to concede. Philip held firm. Ormond pressed harder. Lord Sefton looked increasingly like a man who regretted offering his house for this exercise in futility. That night, at midnight, Sebastian entered Lord Sefton's library carrying 2 documents. The first was the original Fairfax wetland survey. All 214 species, all 47 watercolors, Margaret's work and Vivian's completion bound in leather and stamped with the Fairfax crest. Sebastian had written to Ormond's steward 4 days ago with a polite request to examine the survey for reference purposes. The steward, responding to a ducal inquiry without consulting Ormond, had sent it by messenger. The prerogative of rank, deployed for the first time in Sebastian's life as intervention rather than governance. The second document was Vivian's annotated flood projections, the pages she had fallen asleep constructing, which Sebastian had found and improved with Lockwood estate records. Cross-references to the canal company's own engineering reports that contradicted their viability claims. Parliamentary precedents that supported wetland preservation. his knowledge woven into her science until the argument was unassailable. He sat at Sefton's desk and drafted a cover letter by candlelight. Lord Sefton, I submit for the record material evidence regarding the proposed canal amendment. The enclosed survey represents 10 years of scientific documentation by Margaret Fairfax, Countess of Ormond, completed by her daughter, Vivian Fairfax. The accompanying economic analysis demonstrates that the northern route poses unacceptable risk to agricultural stability and rental income across the affected corridor. I request this evidence be entered into the formal record of these negotiations and distributed to all parties before the final session. He signed it, Sebastian Hale, Duke of Lockwood. The Duke entering evidence against his own faction's position. No speech, no audience, no drama. Just survey placed on a desk where it could not be ignored. A cover letter that named Vivian's contribution in his handwriting, and then the institutional weight of his title applied to the only thing that mattered, keeping Margaret Fairfax's life's work from becoming the instrument of its own erasure. He did not tell Vivian. He did not tell Philip. He placed the documents on Sefton's desk, sealed the cover letter, and left the library in silence. Some things you do not announce. You plant them, and let them grow. Day 20, the final session. Vivian entered the library to find the survey on the table, her mother's illustrations, her own 11 plates, the leather bindings she had last seen in her father's study. Beside it, Sebastian's cover letter, unsealed now, bearing Sefton's notation, received and entered into record, September 19th. Her hands went very still. She opened the cover letter and read, completed by Vivian Fairfax, her name, in Sebastian's handwriting, on an official document bearing the ducal seal. She looked across the table. Sebastian sat in his usual position at Philip's right, his face carefully blank, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He did not look at her. He didn't need to. The evidence was already entered. Lord Sefton called the session to order. Before we proceed to final arguments, I must note that I have received material evidence regarding the canal route, submitted last evening by the Duke of Lockwood. I have reviewed the scientific survey and the accompanying economic analysis. The documentation is compelling. Philip's head turned slowly toward his nephew. Sebastian did not turn back. Ormond leaned forward, his voice sharp. That survey is the property of the Fairfax estate. It was not authorized for... Sefton interrupted. The survey is now part of the parliamentary record. Its disposition is no longer a private matter. The evidence stands. He distributed copies to both factions. Vivian watched her father's face as he opened the survey and saw her name on the title page, written in a hand that was not his own. Ormond's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. What could he say? That he had planned to sell it? That his daughter's work was supposed to be leverage, not evidence? The session proceeded. The arguments were made. The maps were examined one final time. And when Sefton called for the vote, the amendment carried, not unanimously, but clearly. The northern route was abandoned. The southern route, which avoided the wetland corridor entirely, was approved. The canal would be built, but Margaret Fairfax's 10 years of work would remain intact, unprotected now not by sentiment, but by law. The room emptied slowly. Ormond left without speaking to his daughter, his face carved from stone. Philip remained behind, standing beside Sebastian while the others filed out. Philip spoke quietly. That was remarkably stupid. Sebastian's reply was firm. That was necessary. Your mother would have done the same thing. She spent her entire life putting things in the ground that mattered and watching men ignore them. I suppose you decided to stop ignoring. He answered simply. Yes. Philip studied his nephew for a long moment. Then he picked up his papers and walked out, leaving Sebastian alone in the library, with the survey still on the table and the weight of what he had just done settling over him like snow. Vivian found him there an hour later. The library was empty, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and Sebastian stood at the table with his hand resting on her mother's survey, as though anchoring himself. She spoke from the doorway. You entered the evidence last night. He did not turn. I also corrected your flood damage calculations. You understated the 1793 records by a factor of 3. The Lockwood archives are more detailed than yours. You improved my argument. I made it unassailable. There is a difference. Vivian crossed the room and stopped beside him at the table. You wrote my name on the cover letter. Your name belongs on the work. My father will never forgive this. Sebastian finally turned to look at her. Your father pulled up your mother's garden and felt nothing. Forgiveness from a man who treats beauty as inconvenience is not the currency I'm interested in. What currency are you interested in? His voice was quiet. Yours. You named what you loved. I planted it. And then I put your mother's work where no one can uproot it again, not into a garden where a man with a terrace plan can destroy it, but into a record where it stands, permanently, with your name where it belongs. Vivian looked down at the survey, at her name written in his careful script, and felt something unlock in her chest that had been closed for years. You committed faction treason. I committed accuracy. Your mother's science was correct. The northern route would have caused the flooding you predicted. I simply made sure the people who needed to hear it could not ignore it. By signing your name to evidence against your own family's position. By signing my name to the truth. My mother spent her life doing the same thing, putting beauty into the world and watching men with power dismiss it as decoration. I am tired of dismissing things that matter simply because they are beautiful. Vivian reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the survey. Thank you. He met her eyes. You are welcome. And then, quieter. I am sorry it required institutional defiance to accomplish what should have been obvious. Most worthwhile things do. They stood there in the empty library with their hands touching on her mother's work, and outside the window, the September afternoon was fading into the particular golden light that comes just before autumn turns cold. Somewhere in the house, Maisie was probably explaining to Primrose why adults made everything so complicated. And in the east parterre, 5 white peonies were settling their roots deeper into Blackmir's soil, waiting for June. Dusk found them in the garden. Vivian had expected Sebastian to be in the library, or the morning room, or anywhere civilized people went after upending parliamentary negotiations. Instead, she found him in the east parterre, kneeling in the soil beside the second Duchesse de Nemours specimen, with his coat discarded on the bench and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. He was adjusting something in the earth around the plant, his hands moving with the careful precision of someone who had done this before, and then stopped and was now remembering how. He spoke without looking up. The root collar settled unevenly. I should have checked it 3 days ago. Vivian stood at the edge of the bed and watched him work. Watched his hands in the soil. The concentration on his face, the fact that he was gardening in daylight for the first time in 9 years, and had chosen to do it now, after committing the most public act of defiance of his adult life. She observed quietly. You are adjusting a peony. I am correcting a planting error, which was technically true, but also entirely beside the point. In front of witnesses. You are hardly a crowd. I am a witness, and you are gardening, in daylight, with your hands in the soil, after 9 years of walking through your mother's garden without touching it. Sebastian's hands stilled in the earth. He sat back on his heels and looked up at her, and his face was unguarded in a way she had never seen, exhausted and relieved, and something else she could not name. His answer was simple. Yes. Vivian knelt beside him, her skirt spreading over the grass, and placed her hands beside his in the soil around the peony root. Show me the crown position. Sebastian's breath caught. Then his hands moved to cover hers, adjusting her grip on the root ball. 2 inches below the soil line, crown facing east. Morning light reaches the petals before the heat can damage them. Your mother's method, he agreed. My mother's method. And now, he adjusted her fingers, his hands warm over hers in the cool earth. Yours. They knelt there together, both holding the same root, both in the garden that had broken Sebastian's paralysis open. And Vivian understood that this was the language they had been building since the first day. Not words, but gestures. Not declarations, but evidence. Things planted in the dark that grew toward light. Her voice was quiet. I was frightened that naming what I loved would give you a weapon. He acknowledged it. I know. You gave me a garden instead. He confirmed it. Yes. That is the only distinction that has ever mattered, and I have never encountered it before. Sebastian's hands tightened over hers around the root. Neither have I. She turned her head and found his face 6 inches from hers, close enough that she could see the soil smudged on his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes, the fact that he was looking at her the way people look at things they have been trying not to want. She released the root and reached up with one soil-stained hand to touch his face, her thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone. His voice was rough. "Your hands are filthy." She replied evenly. "So are yours." "I have been gardening." "So have I." The kiss happened in the garden, both of them kneeling in the earth with soil on their hands and the autumn light fading around them. Sebastian's mouth found hers with the kind of desperate precision that comes from wanting something for weeks and finally allowing yourself to reach for it. Vivian's hand fisted in his shirt collar, pulling him closer, leaving a smear of Blackmir earth on the fine linen. She murmured against his mouth, "Your shirt." He kissed her again. "Leave it." Deeper this time. His hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing her jawline while she gripped his shoulders and pulled him down into the grass beside the peonies they had just planted together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian looked down at his shirt and started laughing. Actual laughter, rusty from disuse, but real. There was a perfect handprint of soil on his collar where Vivian had grabbed him. He observed wryly, "Ducal linen." She did not sound remotely sorry. "Ruined. The best thing that has happened to ducal linen in 9 years. He kissed her again because he could, because the paralysis was over, because his hands were in the soil and his mouth was on hers, and nothing about this required permission from anyone, except the two of them. They stayed in the garden until full dark, kneeling in the earth beside the peonies. And when they finally returned to the house separately, propriety observed, appearances maintained, both of them carried soil under their fingernails and the particular exhaustion of people who have just planted something that will require years to reach full bloom. June came to Lockwood with a kind of light that makes promises and keeps them. The chapel wall was covered in peonies. Margaret Hale's 20-year-old Duchesse de Nemours blooming beside the 5 specimens Sebastian had brought from Blackmir the previous autumn. 2 women's gardens merging along a stone wall in morning light, white petals glowing like paper lanterns, just as Vivian's mother had described. Maisie knelt in the grass with a trowel, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Sebastian knelt beside her, his hands guiding hers around a new root ball, another peony, smaller, that Maisie had chosen herself from the Lockwood greenhouse. He instructed patiently, 2 inches, Maisie. If you plant too shallow, the frost reaches the bud. Too deep and it cannot find the light." She asked seriously, "How do you know?" "My mother taught me, and now I am teaching you." "Does it go forward too, the teaching?" "It does if you keep planting." Vivian watched from the path, her hand resting on the chapel wall, and felt the particular satisfaction of watching something you planted take root. Sebastian's hands in the soil, Maisie's hands beside his. 2 generations of Hale gardeners kneeling in the earth for the first time since Margaret died, and the paralysis finally, permanently broken. She walked to them and knelt in the grass, her skirt spreading over the ground. Maisie looked up. "Miss Fairfax, is this the right depth?" Vivian examined the planting. "Perfect. Your uncle taught you well." "Will it bloom next June?" Vivian smiled. "It will. Peonies are patient. You plant them and they wait. That is faith." Sebastian's hand found hers in the grass, his fingers threading through hers, and Maisie looked at their joined hands and then at Primrose and whispered something that sounded like, "I told you they would go to the peonies." Autumn returned to Lockwood with the kind of settling that comes after things have been decided. Vivian's desk sat in the library overlooking the east garden, installed by the window where morning light came earliest. On it, the Fairfax Wetland Survey, rebound and published by the Royal Horticultural Society under both names, Margaret Fairfax, Countess of Ormond, and Vivian Fairfax. Her mother's work and her own completion credited equally, distributed to botanical libraries across England. Sebastian entered and placed a letter on her desk. "The Society has requested permission to reproduce your mother's water iris illustrations for their spring journal." Vivian looked at the letter without opening it. "My father has not written. Your father is adjusting to a world in which his daughter is credited for work he tried to sell. It is a difficult adjustment for men who are accustomed to controlling everything." Vivian picked up the letter and opened it. "They want to publish the full survey, all 214 species." Sebastian's voice was certain. "Your mother's legacy. Permanent." The door opened and Maisie appeared, tracking soil across the carpet, a permanent condition since June. She carried a small sketch in her hand, drawn in careful pen and ink, a primrose, botanically precise, with root structure notations in the margin. She placed it on Vivian's desk with the solemnity of someone delivering important documents. She announced formally, "For the collection." Vivian picked up the sketch and examined it. Sebastian's technique. Sebastian's mother's technique. Passed down to a child who would carry it forward. She opened the survey and tucked the primrose sketch inside beside the Duchesse de Nemours drawing Sebastian had left on her desk at Blackmir 9 months ago. She smiled. "Thank you," Maisie replied seriously. "You are welcome. Primrose says you should come see the new bed we planted. It has your name on the marker." "My name?" Uncle Sebastian made a sign. "It says Vivian's garden, and it has primroses and peonies and the iris from your mother's survey. He says every garden should have a name so people know who it belongs to." Vivian looked at Sebastian. He had the grace to look slightly sheepish. He admitted carefully, "I may have committed some additional planting, without telling me. I wanted it to be a surprise. Also, you were occupied with the Society's correspondence, and I did not want to interrupt." "You planted me a garden," he corrected gently. "I planted us a garden." Maisie helped. "It is technically a collaborative effort." Vivian stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the east garden was dormant for winter, but she could see the new bed clearly. A curved border along the south wall, already mulched for the cold months, with a wooden marker bearing her name in Sebastian's careful script. The architecture was visible even in dormancy. Spacing, depth, crowns facing east beneath the soil, waiting for spring. Sebastian's hand settled on her shoulder, his thumb tracing the nape of her neck. She leaned back against him and felt the particular peace that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be. She said softly, "Thank you." He replied warmly, "You are welcome, though I should warn you that Maisie has plans for expansion. She believes the garden requires a section for vegetables, and she has very strong opinions about the placement of the bean trellises. She is your niece." His voice was quiet. "She is my mother's granddaughter, and she is going to be a better gardener than either of us." Outside, the dormant garden held its architecture beneath the soil, roots spreading, crowns waiting, everything planted and patient. Maisie ran across the lawn toward the new bed, primrose tucked under her arm, already planning next season's additions. And in the library, 2 people stood together at the window, all watching the garden grow forward into the future they had planted together. Everything planted, everything waiting, everything beginning to bloom.